It's no secret, you can't build a real application without having authentication. With Next.js specifically, this becomes a little tricky considering you can run code on the front end and the back end. Having worked at an authentication company myself, I actually know just how difficult it is to do that without finding the right tools. So let's see how to add authentication to a Next.js 14 application using Clerk and Xata. And at the end, I'll show you one common mistake I often see and how to avoid it. All right, let's start by creating a brand new Next.js project. So we'll actually start completely from scratch. So on the Next documentation, we have the npx create next app command, and we'll do @latest, which will give us a version, in this case, 14.0.1. We'll say, yes, let's install, and we'll call this next auth demo. And in this case, I am going to use TypeScript. By default, that's what I do. I also use ESLint and Tailwind CSS because why not? We use the source directory. That means all of our kind of code that we write is going to be inside of a source directory, which is nice. And we'll also use the app router, which has been stable now for a while and is kind of the recommended way, as you can see here, to build Next.js applications going forward. Now, I don't need to customize the default imports or like aliases, so we'll just go ahead and let this run. And when this is up, we'll open it up and get started. All right, so that just finished, and I can open this in the same VS Code window that I'm in by doing code-r and then the directory that I want. So this will be the next auth demo, and we will open this up. I don't need to restart VS Code right now. It's already installed all of our packages, so we can just run npm run dev. One thing I need to make sure, and you will too, is I'm using a version, I think it's 18 or above of Node. So I'm gonna switch to version 20, and then we'll do an npm run dev on this just to see what we get by default. So let's open up localhost 3000, and you'll see we get a bunch of stuff in here. We're basically going to rip all this stuff out, but this is the starter application that it comes with. So let's go and do a little bit of cleanup. So inside of the source directory, we have layouts and pages directories or page files. And these are the way we do the app directory inside of Next.js 13 and 14. And this is where we have everything kind of grouped by folders, and in each folder for a route, we'll have pages and layouts if we so choose. So let's open up the page. I'm going to get rid of everything inside of main. And in this case, we can just put in here in H1 to say Next.js auth tutorial. And we'll save that, and that should get rid of kind of everything else on here. And we see that show up there. So that works. And then inside of the layout is going to be used as basically like a root layout in this case, and it's going to be used by any nested directory. So in this case, we have a few class names we have the class names that include the font that we're using up here. I'm going to get rid of the enter font, and I just want to create something that'll give us kind of a base layout to use through the rest of the page or rest of the pages. So I'm going to give a min height of screen to make sure this at least takes up the entire height of the screen. Then I'm just going to use a display of flex and then justify center and items center. All right, so that's just in it horizontally and vertically. And then I'm going to go back to the page. I'm going to get rid of the stuff that they have on here because it's kind of doing the same thing. And I just want that to be in the root layout so that we can share this. And then lastly, I'm going to give this some padding. All right, so now you see that just centered horizontally and vertically on the screen just so we can keep it all there. Now, what we're going to want to have is a dashboard route where we want to gate that based on we only want to let authenticated users into the dashboard route. So to create new routes in Next.js, we do the folder structure. So we create a folder called dashboard, and then inside of here, we'll create the page.tsx file. And then I've got a little snippet for a React functional component, and I want to call this the dashboard page. And then we'll just add in a little bit of text to reiterate that. And then now this should be hosted as its own route. So we could go from home to dashboard directly. So you see that change there. Now, one thing we might want to do is create a navbar where we can list out the links and navigate between these pages as we go and add our authentication so we can prove how we navigate to and from different directories. Now, we could add this component right inside of the app directory. We could also add a components directory and add things in here. So it's kind of up to you how you do this. I'm going to add it inside of the components directory for now, but it really is up to you, whatever you want to do. So I've created that nav component. I'm going to paste in a quick reference for this component so we don't have to build it all from scratch, but we'll talk through what's here. So we have a header tag, we have a nav tag, we have some basic styles in here. And then on the left-hand side, we have a link that just goes to the home page, just like a basic Navbar. And then on the far side, we're going to have a link that goes to the dashboard page. So we have a link for home on the left and a link for dashboard on the right. Now, eventually we'll put more links into this section. So we'll actually surround that with a div, but for now we can just save that. Now, what we want to do is add this inside of our layout as well. So inside of our layout above the children, we'll want to add the nav component. Now, one of the things we will have to move now, since we're referencing a nav inside of our body, is we'll want to add an inner div to wrap the children and then add the styles for the centering of everything inside of that nested div. So we'll do class name equals, add these styles here. And now we should see that we have our navbar above the main content, which is down here. So that looks like it works pretty well. And we can test out the navbar by navigating to dashboard, back to home, etc. So you see that is going between pages. And now we can start to look into how do we add authentication to protect the individual pages here. So let's go into Clerk.com. And this is where they have a beautiful site here, I think. And they have a bunch of widgets built in that are really nice for adding sign in. You can customize it for all the different social media platforms or things that you want to allow your users to log in with. And I don't know, the site is just really nice. So anyway, we are going to start building for free. So if you haven't signed up for a free account, you'll need to do that. And I'm going to go to my dashboard. Now, I've already created one application for an example that I'm working on in the past. I'm actually doing a build in public with Next.js and Clerk and Xata and Sentry. And if you're interested in learning more about that, following that journey, you can subscribe to my newsletter at jamesqquick.com/newsletter, and I'll send updates there. But let's add an application here, and let's just call this Next.js test authentication. And again, really cool. You can enable different ways to log in with the email address, phone number, username, and then get into social providers like Google, Facebook, Apple, etc. Now, they also show you, it's really cool, they kind of show you here what this widget is going to look like, and they give you this widget by default. So it's really neat. You can add phone number, and again, they show all of that stuff. So anyway, we will just start with the popular of email address and Google, and we'll go ahead and create this application, and it'll kind of walk us through what we need to do. So it's selected Next.js by default for a project, and we need to add environment variables for this to our application. So we can go into our source code and add a .env variable or file for our variables, and we'll just copy these in. So we now have those things saved, and then it says we can continue in the docs to be able to set this up. So let's go into the docs, and the first thing, as you might expect, is to actually install the Clerk Next.js package. So we'll let that install run, and we'll come back and check the docs. It says we need to set the environment keys, and then we need to wrap the app in Clerk Provider. Now, the really good thing about this is that Clerk is already supporting the app router and the pages router for Next.js. So we're fully supported here with the app router. So let's close this one, go back to the layout component, and then we will wrap the HTML tag with the Clerk Provider. So we'll surround this whole thing here, and that'll give us access on the server and on the client to the user state, and then be able to gate pages based on that. It's really neat the way this works. So we wrap that, and now we have access to all the stuff we will take advantage of in a minute. The next thing we will do, though, is add a middleware.ts file. So this will go inside of the source directory in here. So inside of source, we will add middleware.ts. And it's not TSX because it's not a React component, it's just TypeScript. And basically what this is saying is this is our ability to define middleware that then is going to gate all pages that match this format. So by gate, I mean you only allow users that are logged in to be able to get to this point. So we don't want users to get to any pages that this matches, which right now is all of them. We'll talk about how to change that in a minute. And I believe now if we were to run this application, so if we do an npm run dev, and we go back to the running application, it's actually going to automatically go ahead and redirect us to a login page. So this just redirected us over to Clerk. So this login page is hosted by Clerk. I'll show you how to add an embedded one in a little bit. But I can add my james.q.quick Gmail, and now I'm coming back to the application, and I'm actually logged in at this point, although you can't really tell anything that's going on because we don't see anything different. So what we can do is start to kind of show and hide something in the nav bar based on whether or not we are logged in. So let's open up the nav. And inside of here, we need to be able to check whether or not the user is actually logged in to be able to conditionally display different pages. So because we're going to do that on the client, we're going to need to mark this component as a client component. So use client. This signifies in Next.js that this will run actual JavaScript on the browser. So from here, we can use the use user hook. This comes from Clerk Next.js package. And from that, we can destructure the user and is loaded property. So basically what happens is this JavaScript code, when the page gets loaded, is going to run. It's going to check to see whether or not the user is authenticated. If it is, the user will be set. If not, the user will be null or undefined. And then it also gives you an idea of whether or not it's finished loading, checking that. So you could display something else in the meantime if you wanted to. So let's actually surround this part with some logic to check whether or not the is loaded is already true and we do have a user. So if we've already loaded and we do have a user, we want to display the link for the dashboard. So if we go back and refresh, we should see this is going to show dashboard. Notice it doesn't show immediately because it's doing that check to see if the user is authenticated. So one additional thing that we might want to do is add the ability for a user to sign out. Now it's really cool because Clerk already has this taken care of also. So what I want to do is I want to wrap the link that I just created inside of a fragment in React. And then what that allows me to do is add a separate link or an additional link inside of this. So this link is actually going to be a button, and this is going to come from the user button that comes from the Clerk Next.js package. And the fact that this has so many things already taken care of for us is really nice. Now, one thing we do have to configure is the after sign out URL, or we don't have to, but we will here by default, or we will here anyway. And that's where we set after the user is signed out, we want to redirect the user to the home page. So let's just see what this gives us. This gives us an icon in the top right with a picture of ourselves, and we can click on that and we can manage our account and we can sign out. So manage account pops up with all the account information that we can tweak and customize. That's really cool. And then also we have the ability to sign out from here. So if we go to sign out, we now see that that piece in the dashboard disappears because we're only displaying those links if the user is signed in. Now, one additional thing you might have noticed is that it then redirected us back to the login page. And that's because right now our configuration for this, if we go back to the layout, or actually into the middleware, our configuration says basically to protect every single route by default. So any route that the user would go to right now would be protected, which means they would have to then log in. But we want to customize that to allow the user to get to the home page without being logged in. So to do this, we can add a public routes property to this auth middleware, and we pass in an array of routes that we want to be public. And so we can just add in the root page to say that will be public while the rest is not. So before we log in, let's just go to localhost 3000. Now this should be okay to go to, which is perfect. If we were to go to /dashboard though, we will now be redirected to our hosted sign-in page. We can then sign in and then be redirected back to the application. And now we see our logged in items in the navbar. Now, one thing we may not want, and you can kind of figure this out for yourself, is what if the user is logged in and then they try to go to the home page? Well, in that case, we could, if we wanted to, actually redirect them back to the dashboard. So let's go into the home page. So just page in the app directory. And we can do some logic in here to check whether or not that user exists. If they do, then redirect them over to the dashboard page. So we can use the auth function from Clerk Next.js package. And from here, we can grab the user ID. So this is all running on the server because these pages are server components by default. And then inside of here, we can say if there is a user ID, we want to redirect the user using the next navigation redirect function to the /dashboard page. So again, we've already accessed in the nav component on the client using use user hook, we've accessed the user. Now on the server, we can use this auth function to gather the user ID and then be able to do anything we want based on that. So this is saying if the user does exist and they try to go to the home page, redirect them to the dashboard. So if I try to go home, this should now redirect me. You kind of see a little flash there of going back to the dashboard. Cool. Now, the next thing we might want to do is work on saving some data. And for this, we're going to use Xata, which is an awesome platform that I've been using in my build in public. They have AI vector search built in, they have search capabilities built in, and they just have a visual dashboard for creating content. So let's go ahead and sign in. You can create a free account if you want. You can see I've used many databases in here. But let's just create a database, and let's just say that we're going to call this our test auth DB. So let's go ahead and create this, and we'll open it. And inside, what you'll see is that we have the ability to create tables with a visual editor, which is really, really nice. So I'm going to add an empty table, and I'm just going to call this folders. So in the dashboard that I'm working on, I allow users to create folders to organize content. So we'll create a users table or a folders table. And then inside of here, we'll create another column, and then we'll have a string, which is the name of the folder. So not too much specific going on here, just letting the user create new folders, and then eventually we'll display them based on the user as well. So we can mark this as unique. And now we have our name property. We also have our database. Now, how do we then connect our locally running application to Xata to be able to make all this stuff work? Well, the cool thing is that Xata has a CLI where I already have this installed, but I can run the Xata init function, and this will connect this application to a database inside of Xata. So you can see it asks me which one I'm working with. I can go to the test auth DB, say, yes, that's the one. We want to make sure that a .env file is added to the .getignore. Yes. What kind of code do we want it to generate for us? This is the beauty of Xata, is that it generates TypeScript code for us. So we already have our types. So in this case, I'm going to choose TypeScript, and then we can tell it to output the code to the source/Xata file. So it did two things. It updated our .env file, so .env. Now this added in an API key and which branch we're working on, something we won't even get into in this video, but is really neat. So we have our API key to be able to connect to that Xata database from our locally running application. Now the other thing it did was install the Xata client, which we'll use in a minute. And then lastly, if we look inside of the code, it created a Xata.ts file, which is the file that holds the types for our table. So you can see it defines the table here, our folders table, and then the columns. And then it does some TypeScript fanciness with inferring what the types are and then gives us access to that. It also then allows us to get an instance of the client by calling this get Xata client function. And we can use that to now be able to generate data. So let's just go back into this and let's create a couple of different rows. So we'll call this folder 1 and we'll create folder 2. Now this is all just kind of simple dummy data, but let's go into our dashboard. So let's go into the dashboard and let's now use the Xata client by calling get Xata client. And so we'll call this Xata client. And then from here, we can use our Xata client. If we go into .db then we can see the tables that we have based on that TypeScript, so folders. And we can call the get many function because we just want to get a list of the folders that are available. So we'll call this folders, and this is going to come from awaiting the call to the database. Now to work with this, we have to tag this as an async function. And now remember, these are all server components by default, which means we can run awaits right inside of here and then reference our backend environment variables. It's used underneath the hood with this function here. But we can do all that on the server without having to worry about giving up our secret credentials. So this is all safe to do just like we are. Now we have our dashboard page. I'm going to wrap this inside of an H1. And then this won't look great, but underneath that, we can have a folders.map, get a reference to each folder, and then we can just add a p tag for the folder dot, and this should be map instead of maps. The last thing we need to do is add the key prop, and we can reference the folder.id for the key. So we should be able to save this and make sure we're running the application. So rerun this with npm run dev, then go and refresh. Then go and refresh on our page, and you see we have our folder 1 and folder 2 listed for us. So we're able to query all this data and be able to get back the associated data. So now one thing we might want to do though is try to integrate the stuff that we're doing in Xata with the actual authentication that's happening in Clerk. So how do we associate data from Xata with our user that's saved inside of Clerk? Well, we do that using the user ID of the user. So for every folder that gets created, we want to attach that to a specific user ID. So to demonstrate this, let's create a new component for our dashboard. And we can actually create this right inside of the dashboard folder, or we can call this the folder form component. And let's just stub this out. So we have that. And I'm going to paste in some markup. And this is mostly going to be a basic form. So let's just take a look at what we have. We have a form defined here. We have a few Tailwind classes. We have a label, which is the name of the folder. And then we have the input, which is the actual input text. And lastly, we have our submit button. Now notice that I have this referencing an action function that I haven't defined yet. This is going to get into server actions, which we'll see in a second, but that allows us to handle this form submission and actually display whatever data we want, and then save the data to the database. So we haven't defined this yet. So let's just first define this function. So this will be an async function called create. Actually, folder is what it should be. So create folder. And then this will be a function that takes in a parameter of form data, which is of type form data. And then we will need to do something inside of here. Now, to make sure that we define this to only be running on the server, this function is defined with the annotation of use server. So in this case, from here, we can just log out the form data.get and then get the folder property, which is actually name. So we're looking for the name of the folder. So we can just log that out on the server. So let's go ahead and save this. We'll actually need to add this to the dashboard page as well. So on the dashboard page, we'll want to display the folder form. And then I'm going to add a few classes in here. So I'm going to add a div with a class of MB of 10, just to give some spacing between everything. And then from the H1, we'll give this a class of MB4 to give some additional spacing. So we should see we have our dashboard page header. We have our form with the folder name and then the submit button. And then we have our list of folders that were created. So we can type in here folder 3 and press submit. And if we come back, we should see this actually logged into the console. And this is logging to the console because this is being run on the server instead of the client. So if we look inside of the browser, just to confirm where this code is running, we won't see any logs in here to show what we just saw on the server. I'm going to zoom in a little bit to make this a little bit bigger. So that's working as we expect. Now we want to take that from there and actually use this to be able to create a new folder inside of Xata. So we can start to reference the name. So we can say const name equals, and then get the name there. And then from here, we can use our Xata client. So let's get the Xata client again by calling get Xata client. Then we can use that, go to dbs dot, and then we'll go to folders, and then we'll call create, and we'll pass in an object that takes a name property or has a name property. Now this TypeScript is telling us that this property is actually required, and we have no guarantee that this name property exists from the form. So one of the things we could do is check to see if there is no name, then we could do something else, and we could just return in here if there is not a name. Now, instead of hard coding this check in here, one thing we can do, and this is on the documentation for Next.js 14, is to use a package called Xad. So we can install Xad, and this is a validation package that we can use, and we can define a schema. And so we'll do this from z.object. And this Z is going to come from Xad. So we'll add the import for Xad. And then inside of this, we will now define the name property to be of type string with a minimum of 5 characters, for example. All right. And then from there, we can ingest the data from the form into this Xad schema. So we can call schema.parse and then set a key to name and then a value to what comes back from that form. So this should now give us the parsed form or validated form or whatever we want to call it. So this has a property of name, and now we can get rid of our own manual check, and we can now pass that object into our create. So parsed form, and this is now validated as having a name property that is of type string. So we can go from here and wait for that create to happen. And now we can save and run this application again. And hopefully we'll see that we're able to save data into the actual database. So we'll refresh, we'll type in folder 3, We'll submit this. We don't really see anything happen here, but if we go back to our Xata table, we should see now our third folder is created. So if we go back to the application and reload, it now shows our new folder. But we probably want that to show by default. So one of the things that we can do is after this happens successfully, we can call revalidate path, and that will kind of revalidate or recheck for the data for this page. So if we tell this to revalidate this path, and now we try this again, so we type in folder of 4, we can now do the revalidation and it will show up with our folder. But you'll notice that this folder 4 still stays here, so we actually want to reset the form after this is submitted. Now, I don't know the best answer to do this, but one of the answers that I found is to be able to mark this form as a use client. So this is client-side code, and then we can add a ref to the actual form element and then be able to, inside of the action, go ahead and reset that form. So let's just copy over a few pieces of code to be able to do this. Inside of here, we'll annotate this with use client. And then inside of the component below the create folder, we can paste in this ref and then import the use ref. And we're saying the ref is going to be attached to an HTML form element, which is what we've defined down here. So we can set the ref to the ref that we just defined. And then inside of the action, we're going to define kind of an inline function here. And then inside of the inline function, we're going to do two things. So this is going to take in the form data. And then what we're going to do is call the create folder function by passing in that same form data. And then we're also going to reference our ref and then current. And if there is a current, then we're going to call reset on that form. Now, one of the things that Next.js doesn't like is that it doesn't want us to define a server function inside of a client component. So one of the things that we can do is we can copy and paste this and move this to the root dashboard page. So we can define this in here and then make sure we copy over our schema as well. So we'll copy and paste over our schema. We'll make sure to get the import for Zod. We can add all missing imports, which will get the import for the revalidate path as well. So we've copied this over, and now we need to pass in this function into the folder form. So we can pass in a property of handle create form, and this will be the handle, or this will be the create, and this will be the create form function, create folder function. And I keep saying form, this should be folder. And then inside of our component, our folder form component, we now need to define a property, which is handle create folder. And we'll define types for this as well. So handle create folder is a function that takes in form data, which is of type form data, and then returns void. So we have that defined. Now we can call the handle create folder from inside of our client component, even though we defined it inside of our page component, which is a server component. So now hopefully this puts everything together, and we can now enter in the folder 5. And what should happen is it should show up with folder 5 down here and then also reset the form. So we do submit, we see that this disappears up here, and we also see folder 5 listed. So now that we have all this working, what we want to do is now make this connection between the user in Clerk and all the data that we store in Xata. Now, I kind of referenced at the beginning of this video a mistake that I often see people make, and this is what's going to help address that. Now, Clerk is built to take care of sensitive information about a user, like passwords and tokens and all the private information that you want to make sure doesn't get leaked in your application. So my recommendation is to let providers like Clerk take care of all of that stuff. And then we can use our own database for additional associations with the user, or if we want to do additional properties for a user like profile information or additional things like that, I think that works well to tie into a table inside of Xata. So let's start by associating all of this data with an individual user. So for this, we're going to need to add another property for each record for a user ID. So we can add this here. Now the user ID for these won't be unique, but we do want to make sure that it is not null. So we can add a default value in here of the string null, which doesn't really matter, but we want to make sure that this thing is required. Now let's go and see what the actual user ID is for a given user. So to do that, we've already accessed this inside of our code so far. And this is inside of the root page directory, and we can just log this on the server, user ID. So now we can navigate back to our application and try to go to the home page. We'll be redirected to the dashboard, which is fine. But then if we come back in here, we should see our user ID is logged out. And now we can go back into Xata and then set the user ID for these records. Now, I'm not going to set it for folder 4 and folder 5 because I want to show you something that's really important in a second. So if we look in here, we should see that we're still getting all of our folders, and that's because we're not filtering our data based on the actual user ID. So in the dashboard homepage, we actually want to reference that same user ID. So we can reference the same auth function from Clerk Next.js, and then we can destructure the property of a user ID that comes back from that. Now from there, we want to actually query all of our folders based on the user ID. So we can call in a filter function, and then inside of this filter function, we can define what we want to filter by. And we want to filter by the user ID equaling the user ID of the logged in user. So we only want to get information associated with the logged in user. Now notice this is giving me a TypeScript error. That's because we haven't regenerated our types after adding that additional property inside of Xata. So to get an updated type for our table, we can run Xata cogen, and this will regenerate all of those types, and then we should have an error that goes away now. Now, the last thing is it says that this thing can't be null, but what happens is this could be null up above. So really what we want to do is do a quick check to say if we don't have a user ID, the user shouldn't be here anyway. So we could call a redirect from Next Navigation and just redirect this user back to the home page. So now by the time we get to the point of trying to save a folder or query folders based on the user ID, we should only get the folders that are associated with this logged in user because we know this user is logged in based on their user ID. So we can save this and make sure we rerun our application. And then what we'll see is when we refresh our folder page in the dashboard or the list of folders inside of the dashboard, we should see that we only see folder 1, 2, and 3. So now you see we only have folders 1, 2, and 3. And I don't think we need to go through and test this, but we could log out with this account, sign in with another account, associate certain data with that user, and then be able to show that the different ones are only showing up for the appropriate user. But the last thing we need to do is inside of our folder form now, or inside of the function that we call to save that, we want to make sure that we now get the user ID and attach that to the form, the parse form that we add in. So we can create a new variable called new record, for example, and we can spread in the parsed form data, and then we can set the user ID to be the user ID again of the logged in user. Now we have that referenced up there, so we should be able to just pass that in as a value for our new record, and then we'll save our new record into the database. Now, this is giving a similar issue to what we had earlier where we needed to double check to see that that user ID did exist. So we can just add a quick check in here to say if the user ID doesn't exist, we can just return out and move that above the creation of the new record and then pass that in to create. Now you could add some additional logic in here to do whatever you wanted, but let's go back over to our application and let's try to add a new folder. So we add folder 6, we should see it disappears here, and then it also then redisplays inside of the browser. That means if we refresh, we see this showing up as well. And then if we go back to Xata, we see folder 6 and the user ID is being set correctly. So this is the key for me of integrating an authentication platform like Clerk with something like Next.js is keying off of this user ID. So we can show ownership for any record inside of Xata based on that user ID, which is associated with the actual user information stored in Clerk. This is the key between the two. Now, Clerk also has some ability to do metadata on a user object, but what happens is you have to tap into their specific API to be able to update metadata on the user that they keep track of. So I think that it makes a lot more sense and we have more control of being able to add properties inside of information like this, or if we create an additional user settings or user profile table inside of Xata, we would do the same thing where we key off of that user ID and we now have control over that information while leaving the security and stuff that needs to be secure stuff to Clerk because they have spent lots of time and money on making sure that stuff is secure. Now, one last thing I told you I would show you how to do is to customize the sign in and login pages. So right now, if we try to go to the dashboard page, it will force us to the login page. And if we look at the URL, this is actually hosted by Clerk. So this is a page hosted by Clerk somewhere else instead of an embedded login page that we control in Next.js. So let's see how to do that. Let's go back to the documentation, and they reference building your own signup page, and they even give you sign up and sign in components that you can use yourself. So what I'm going to do is actually just copy this route. So let's copy the route, and let's go into our app directory. I'm going to create a new file and paste in that route. Now this looks a little odd, but what I did was paste in the signup directory, and then the signup folder underneath that has the angle brackets and the ... And this basically allows this page to be dynamic and to handle any sort of additional URLs past just sign up. So we don't have to worry about that too much. All we really need to do is just copy the sign up component into here. So we'll paste that in, and then we do the same thing for the sign in page. So we paste in our route. So let's go back to app and create a new file, paste in that route again. So that will create the sign in component and its page. So now we can paste in the code for that. And again, this is just using sign in and sign up components from Clerk. Now, the last thing is we need to be able to tell our environment to be able to do the redirects to these pages for sign up and sign in. And then we need to handle the where do we redirect the user back to after they've signed in. So let's go back into our .env and let's paste in these properties, and notice that we have a reference to the sign in page, the sign up page, and then where do we want to redirect the user to after sign in and sign up? Well, in this case, we want to redirect the user back to the dashboard page. So we can save this and hide our .env again. And now I think this should be ready to go. So if we go back to our application, we could go to the /sign in page, and this should allow us to see an embedded sign in page, just like we saw before, but now hosted on our own Next.js application. And we could start the process of handling sign in, redirect over to Google, get redirected back to our application, and now it will redirect us to the dashboard page, which is exactly what we want. So let's just log back out so we can see this one more time. So in the sign in page, you also have the ability to customize this completely. So you can actually go in and target any of the classes in here, any of the items in here, and target them with Tailwind classes to be able to style this however you want. So in this case, you get full ability to customize what the sign in and the sign up forms look like and make sure that they're on brand with your application. So that is setting up authentication inside of Next.js 14 using Clerk and Xata, and then showing the relationship between the two of how to associate data inside of Xata with the Clerk user. If you're interested in learning more about all the stuff I'm working on, you can sign up for my newsletter at jamesqquick.com/newsletter. I'm going to continue to be working with Next.js 14, with Xata, with Clerk, with Sentry. I'm going to add in features around AI. I've got a lot going on. So if you want to check that out, check it out at my newsletter for more updates on a regular basis. I'm also planning on building a course around this over the next few months. So I'll probably create a landing page for that soon, and I'll let you know in the newsletter, if you're there, where to find it and how to sign up for that as well. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what other questions or things you'd like to see covered in Next.js with Clerk, with Xata, etc. in the comments below, and I'll try to create some additional content to make sure to fill all those voids. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time.